My name is Stephen Wetmore. I'm the chair of the Department of Family Medicine. For those of you that go by our department, it's down on the first floor. It's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to this seminar on behalf of the Department of Family Medicine, on behalf of Dean Michael Strong, on behalf of Merrick Zornstein, who's the Director of Research in our department, and also on behalf of Amardeep Thind and the Interprofessional Program of Public Health. This is the first research seminar that involves interaction between our department, the Family Medicine Department, and the program in Public Health. Many people have talked about the potential for this building, involving both family medicine and the public health program, to create important and interesting educational events and endeavors. And this is an example, I think the first example of how this could be. We have some very interesting guests this afternoon that you're going to learn who they are and what they have to say about gorillas and public health. So this is an opportunity for public health and family medicine to get together to create something that could benefit not only our own patients and populations here, but populations of people around the world, and of course also the gorillas. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Amardeep Thind, who's going to introduce the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Steve. So just to add to what Steve has said, from our perspective in public health, what we want to do is to give you an opportunity to interact with experts in various cutting-edge fields across the world. So remember we talked about the Thursday afternoon seminars. This is an example of one of those where we just wanted to interact with some experts in a completely relaxed, non-academic atmosphere. So I know you're sitting in your seats and you have a plate of food in front of you, hopefully, and a full stomach. But the idea is this is not part of a didactic teaching, but this is more as a way of exposure for you to come in contact with some really novel concepts that are making a difference across the world. Okay, so in that way, this is sort of the first kickoff of that brown bag series. Now, with respect to my role, I'm going to be sort of the moderator here. We have two presenters who are going to present for about an hour. And shortly, I'll request Rick Quinn, who's a faculty member here in the Department of Ophthalmology, to introduce the two speakers from University of California, Davis, who've been working on this concept of One Health. So what we'll do is we will go on and have a presentation for about an hour. Then we have about half an hour devoted for Q&A. And if those of you who are so enthused by this concept of One Health that you can't let go of the speakers, they've kindly consented to be here for you to grill them a little bit longer beyond the mandated half an hour Q&A. Okay. So without further ado, let me bring forward Rick Quinn. Rick is a faculty member here in the Department of Ophthalmology, but his task is a tongue twister. He's a primate ophthalmologist.
Veterinary ophthalmologist.
Veterinary ophthalmologist. So with that interesting hook as to what is a veterinary ophthalmologist doing in the Department of Ophthalmology at Western, I'm going to let him carry on and do the explaining. Right.
Thank you, Amardeep, and thank you, Steve, and thank you for your hospitality. I am an adjunct professor in the Department of Ophthalmology. I describe my appointment as being largely parasitic. I get way more from them than I give back. Perhaps the tide is turning. I brought two very respected veterinary colleagues, so I'm starting to repay the debt that I owe Western. I'd just like to introduce both of them. Dr. Kirsten Galardi is a veterinarian. She's a specialist in zoonotic medicine surgery. She graduated from the University of California at Davis Veterinary School in 1993 and completed a 3-year residency in medical primatology. Kirsten is the co-director of the Wildlife Health Center at UC Davis College of Veterinary Medicine. Interestingly, she also oversees a CDOC society, so she has her hands in several pies. She is a co-director, along with our other guest, Dr. Cranfield, of the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, the Gorilla Doctors that work out of UC Davis. So Kirsten will enlighten you as to how she sees things from her own perspective. Michael Cranfield, Mike is a veterinarian, graduated from the University of Guelph's Ontario Veterinary College in 1977. He did residency at the Toronto Zoo, and then unfortunately we lost him to Baltimore. He does maintain a faculty position at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and he's a senior veterinarian at the same wildlife research center at UC Davis's College of Veterinary Medicine, and a co-director of the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, the Gorilla Doctors. And so all that aside, in keeping with the non-academic tone of the seminar, where in my world of veterinary medicine, these are the movers and the shakers in the primate world, and the ones that think outside the proverbial box, and the ones that we are certainly proud to put on public display. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Kirsten and Mike, and they will go from here.
Rick.
Thanks very much, Rick. It's been 45 years since I was on this campus last, and my brother was an undergraduate. He invited me down as a teenager to see Chuck Berry. Probably most of you here don't know who Chuck Berry is, but he was one of the grandfathers of rock and roll, so it was a big thrill for me to come then. It's a big thrill to be here today. So today's talk is sort of to get some discussion going on the positive aspects of when health disciplines collaborate in projects in the same location instead of working in silos. And hopefully you'll see the benefit after we get through this. Now I'm going to be talking mainly about gorillas, and Kirsten's going to be putting a bigger picture on it. I'd like to start with the blue marble. This was taken probably 2 decades ago or more, and it sort of inspires people. First of all, you sort of say, wow, you know, the man was able to get into outer space and look back on the world. But it also made people start thinking that the Earth is a finite entity. I mean, that as far as we know now, this is what we have, and this is what we may always have, only. And so when you start thinking about that, and you start thinking that the world population is now at 6.5 billion people and growing, there is a direct conflict for resources at this point. And the conflict is between humans and wildlife. And as that conflict is happening right now, it's changing things. It's changing the amount of biodiversity, and biodiversity is biological strength or resilience. So that's changing, and with that, there's weather patterns that are changing, and with the weather pattern changing, then there's vector distribution changing, and actual pathogen geography changing. So it's very interesting. And then, just talking to Michael about extractive industries and stuff, we are now encroaching on wildlife at a really, really rapid rate. And so we're getting all these novel situations and exposure to wildlife and their pathogens that we've never had before. So it's a very dynamic world right now. So I'm going to talk to you about gorillas, probably more than you care. So that blue band through Africa is the cradle of 4 of the 5 great apes. The orangutans were in Indo-Malaysia. And that only depends if you call man a great ape. So there's the bonobos, the chimpanzees, and the gorillas. And then you have to divide Africa in 2, right down the middle. And in the west, you have the western lowlands. And they're in about 5 countries. And there's probably 110 to 125,000 of them left in the wild. And they're the only ones you'll see in a zoo. So if you've ever seen one in a zoo, it's the western lowland. And they are being hard hit because as man is changing the scenery, the gorillas, or the great apes, are kind of an innocent bystander because there's the susceptibility to the same diseases. So where there were large populations of western lowland gorillas and chimpanzees, they're now called the silent forest because of the disruption in the environment and the emergence of Ebola. They've died by the thousands of Ebola also. And then there's a small, very small remnant population called the cross river gorillas. There's about 300 of them left. Then if we divide Africa, as I said, and we go east, you have the Growers gorilla, or the eastern lowland. And there's probably about 4,000 to 10,000 of them left. In fact, starting probably in 2 weeks, they're going to do a big census on that subspecies. The reason we don't know a whole lot about them is because there's a lot of rebel activity there. The landscape, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is full of natural resources, and there's a lot of fighting over those natural resources. And then you have the mountain gorillas, and there's 2 populations of them. So, sorry, we can't go back. But if you looked at Lake Victoria, it's just over here. So we're in the East Central Africa at this point. And the Growers gorillas are in parks all around here, and the mountain gorillas are in 2 locations: the Virunga Massif, which is in the 3 countries, and the Bwindi Impenetrable Forest. So that sort of gives you some location. And there's 880 mountain gorillas left in the world. Okay, the biggest threats to gorillas in general are logging. And logging does several different things. Obviously, it shrinks the habitat. It fragments the habitat, so that does 2 things. It isolates populations, so there's not a good genetic flow across all the populations like there used to. But it also creates more edge forest, again, so more exposure between wildlife and people. Activities that normally wouldn't go on in the forest to go on. And one of those is bushmeat. And there's nothing wrong with bushmeat if people are living in the forest and hunting to feed their families. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when you try to supply the cities or the mining sites with bushmeat, then you're decimating the wild populations. And that's one of the problems. If you open up the area with these logging roads, then you can get the bushmeat out to the markets easier, which is a problem. Now, the mountain gorillas live in 2 protected areas, and this is the Virunga Massif. So logging isn't a big deal, and bushmeat is not a huge deal. They're still going on in eastern lowlands. So the major threat to the mountain gorillas, and the 3rd most prominent threat of all gorillas, is disease. Because you have a highly susceptible population there, and naive. And so here's an aerial view of the Virunga Massif here. And you have the mountain gorillas, very small population. Reproductive potential is not great compared to some of the other animals. And again, it's highly susceptible to human diseases. And it's sharing this forest with other wildlife. And around here, and you can see that the edge of the park there is very, very sharp. There's no buffer zone there. So the interactions between these populations are extreme. And then you have the highest density of people in all of Africa around here, because it's a very fertile area to grow crops. There is somewhere around 800 to 1,000 people per square kilometer. The average wage of these people is $1 a day. So you can imagine the education level, the medical level, and the hygiene level. And yet they're bordering with one of the most endangered species in the world. And then, of course, they have their companion animals and their livestock that help support that population. I'll deal a little bit more with that, about that before. Mountain gorillas were discovered in 1902 by Robert von Beringi. He's a German fellow, and he just happened to be exploring in the area, and that's Savigno Mountain behind there, and he was up on one of the ridges there, and he saw a big black great ape, and he couldn't figure out what it was. It was too big to be a chimpanzee, and it was too far east to be a gorilla. So he did what all explorers do, and he shot it. And there's a wonderful account of them trying to get it out of the ravines and back to Germany. But they got it back to Germany, and they found it was a subspecies. So then all the natural history museums went out and they collected 54 more, which was really unfortunate. And you'll like to hear this, because I like saying this in America. The American History Museum went out and got 5 of them, and Carl Ackley was the guy that did that. Carl Ackley was a Renaissance guy, and although he saw the science, the value of the science having these specimens, he also saw the beauty of that area and the species, and he could tell that they weren't that plentiful. So he went to King Albert, and they started the Albert National Park, which now is the Virunga National Park, and that was in 1925, and that was the first national park in Africa. He went back to help out and died of dysentery and malaria within a year. This is Diane Fossey, and the only reason I'm standing here is because of her. She came in the late 50s and 60s and was a behavioralist, and she was brought over by Leakey. And she quickly realized that the great apes were, the population was being decimated. And so she went from being a behavioralist to what I call a preservationist. And I call her a preservation rather than a conservationist because she was only focused on mountain gorillas. And she didn't think about other populations of wildlife, and she didn't account for the communities around the park. Now, she did what she had to do, and I'm sure you've probably all seen the movie, and I don't think that the techniques that she utilized then would probably stand the test of time, but she is responsible for saving the gorillas. But the two things that she did, and why I'm standing here, is she habituated them. She got the gorillas so that they were so used to people, and it was a neutral situation. There was no fear either way, that you can, now we can walk up to them. In fact, they're almost over-habituated. They come too close to people. And the other thing, and just as an aside, she named all the individuals, and she named them by looking at their nose prints. Their nose prints are like snowflakes. They're all individual, and we still use that technique. The other thing she did was that she went to Ruth Kiesling, who's the daughter of Mark Morris, Morris Animal Foundation. You may have all heard of it. Well, maybe not if you're a med student. But anyway, it's a pretty big animal organization. And she said, do you think your dad could put a veterinarian on the side of the mountain? And that did happen in 1986, Jim Foster. He was a veterinarian at the Seattle Zoo. And he's considered the first person to treat individual wildlife in its own habitat. And the reason we had to do that, he had to do that, was that at that point there was only 240 mountain gorillas left in the Virunga Massif. And the geneticists said if you don't save these animals on an individual basis, then the population won't be sustainable. So that was the whole concept of why it started. He died, unfortunately, of a heart attack in 1997, and I stepped into his position in 1998. It was a small project then, but we've had the pleasure of growing it, and there's now 15 veterinarians in the 3 countries, 14 of which are in-country veterinarians. There's only 1 expat. As I say, the area and the communities around the mountain are quite compromised. And to add to things, there are politics and tribal issues. And you've probably all heard of the genocide that happened in 1994 in Rwanda. 800,000 to 1 million people killed in 90 days. Neighbors killing neighbors, and that's what, 25 years ago now, or 20 years ago, yeah, so it's 20th anniversary. And so it's a healing country, and so you do have great potential, and President Kagame's come in, and the cities are building up, and things are moving forward, and things are happening in DRC. There's more peace there now than there has been, and the gorillas play a very important part of that. There was over 19,000 gorillas visited last year, each person paying $750 to go see them. That, plus the hotels and the food and all the other industry, brings in about $250 million to Rwanda a year. So it has a huge economic component. So I'd just like to say, our approach is One Health. And we do that because of the close proximity, the extremeness of the proximity, or the populations that are there, the shared pathogens between the 2 groups, and I'll let Kirsten start talking about some of the diseases.
So as Mike said, this is, we sometimes refer to the challenge of mountain gorilla conservation as a One Health perfect storm, because all of these potential threats to the survival of the species involve both people and land use change. And that's really, those forces actually apply to almost any health scenario you can imagine, whether it's great apes, whether it's other wildlife, whether it's human communities. And you all know you're interested in public health, so you think a lot about populations, and you think about the impacts of global change on human health. We have the same concerns, and we think the same way as veterinarians, and especially as grade 8 veterinarians, about the effects of land use change, population growth on the health of great apes. But these forces are really what shape our program and shape this this idea of One Health. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Traditionally, and we could argue this, but I think if you're not in the health profession, somebody from outside our profession looks at a physician, and from a for public health, the traditional physician's role is to control disease, prevent disease in populations. And for veterinarians, the traditional role in the public health realm has been to really ensure that animal sources of food for people are safe for consumption and secure, that production is high, we can feed people. But what we mean when we talk about One Health is shifting that to be a little bit more all-encompassing of the many ways in which our profession, and when I say our profession, I mean our profession, our health profession, whether we're focused on people or animals, could play a role. We were fortunate to have a faculty member at UC Davis many years ago, Calvin Schwabe, who coined this term One Medicine. And it hadn't been used before. He used it in his book about veterinary epidemiology. And really, he was advocating for this unified approach to medicine, for veterinarians not to stay in their silo, corn silo, wheat silo, whatever, and focus just on animals, and for physicians not to stay in their silo and just focus on people, that there needed to be a better integration. And his point was that in the first world, Western world, maybe we forget our dependence on people on animals for our livelihood. But he said, really in developing countries, human and animal lives are very much intertwined and interdependent. And in fact, if you then expand that idea to wildlife, it becomes even more, comes into sharp relief even more, because in many of the places where we work, it's not just the humans and the livestock that are coming into close proximity, but it's wildlife too. They're sharing resources and sharing ever-dwindling resources, whether that's a water hole that's the only place for miles around that people and domestic animals and wildlife are getting their water. And so these connections between people and animals and their environment have very, very profound effects on human health. And in fact, when you look at pathogens, infectious diseases of humans, you all know that the majority of them are zoonotic. They had their origins in animals. And in fact, when you look at emerging infectious diseases, the ones that have arrived on our scene in the last 20 years that have been particularly concerning, so we're talking about SARS, Nipah virus, even HIV. Most of those, 75% of the emerging infectious diseases, have come from wildlife populations. And it's that human contact, that increasing human contact with wildlife that has been linked to this emergence. And as human population growth increases, especially near areas of high biodiversity, the potential for these pathogens to go between populations is quite huge. And really, it's all of us in this room, it's health professionals around the world that are really uniquely positioned to be vigilant for those kinds of events and to be able to implement programs and practices that will limit the potential for animal origin pathogens, especially from wildlife, to infect people. But what Mike was getting at in his first part of his talk is, we have to think about this going in both directions. And we came to this program with a very strong conservation ethic. We want to do whatever we can to save the species, save mountain gorillas, and so we're very concerned about the opposite flow of pathogens. We get concerned about whether pathogens can go from people to gorillas. So when we think about One Health, it's not a discipline. It's really a strategy or perspective, and it's an acceptance of the fact that human and animal and environmental health are very inextricably linked and highly independent on each other. It's a recognition that natural changes in the world, ecosystem level changes, have profound impacts on animals and people, and that our ability to deal with those threats is going to require an integrative approach to health. And that probably, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, that some of the global disease challenges we face really need to be solved through both preventive approaches, but also a lot of dialogue and collaboration among the disciplines. So at UC Davis, at the School of Veterinary Medicine, we established the One Health Institute in 2009. The institute existed primarily in name only until that time when we have a new dean, and he really wanted to promote this strategy and this perspective for training our veterinary students and our residents, and to promote faculty engagement and research. And so we established it really to support and promote the activities that are focused on One Health. The Karen C. Dreyer Wildlife Health Center, which I co-direct and where Mike and I both work, is a major program of the One Health Institute, and all of our programs at the Wildlife Health Center have a main focus of advancing the health of wildlife, but that's always in balance with people and the environment, recognizing that people and the environment and that wildlife and people are sharing are as critical to the disease in that wildlife population as anything else. So we've always had a very strong focus on not the wildlife in isolation, but in the places where they live. We also have a very active Students for One Health Club at the veterinary school. They sponsor a seminar series at our school, and they get together, and in fact, one of their major focuses right now is this Knight's Landing Clinic, which is a clinic that has been set up in a very fairly poor community not far from Davis, California, where our university is, that's primarily supports the migrant farm worker community, and the medical school students and the veterinary students have got together to establish this mobile clinic where medical students and veterinary students together are working in this clinic and seeing human and animal patients. And sometimes families are arriving, and the humans in the family are going to the physicians, and the pets and the livestock in the family are going to the veterinarians, and then the students and the residents are rounding together around the cases that they've seen. And for me, that's probably the most exciting outcome of this push at our school for One Health perspective and strategies, is seeing the students themselves get very, very enthusiastic about it and reach across our medical school. The students are working at a teaching hospital in Sacramento. It's about 15, 20 miles away, and in between is a big delta floodplain for the Sacramento River. They're reaching across that causeway and working very closely with medical students. And in fact, the faculty have also promoted this cross-learning process at the school, where vet students and medical students will get together and do problem-based learning several times throughout the year. So baby steps, but some very significant steps. And I know that at the Knight's Landing clinics, some of those families are getting medical care that they wouldn't otherwise get, because there's this push to serve the community in all aspects of health, not just human, but also animals. So I'll turn it back over to Mike. We're going to spend a little bit of time now telling you about how a couple of our major One Health programs at the Wildlife Health Center work. And we'll start with the Gorilla Doctors program, and then I'll tell you a little bit about another program that we're running that focuses on One Health.
Okay, I'd just like to point out, this is Linda Lowenstein. She's the world's leading primate pathologist, and she just happens to be at UC Davis, which is very helpful for us. Okay, so the way that, as a veterinarian, and looking at wildlife, what One Health means to our program is that you have to have a proactive health monitoring or disease surveillance. And that can be sort of public health monitoring or whatever, it doesn't matter whether it's on an individual level or population level. And then you need clinical treatments or interventions, and those interventions again can be on population level, right? So these can vary in size and scope. And then you have to redo individual postmortems, but you have to have morbidity and mortality surveillance also. So then you take those three activities and you apply them to these different areas. And the target species obviously here is gorillas and other wildlife that are associated with them, the human population, the livestock and companions, and the habitat. I'll start off with the habitat. Now the habitat seems very straightforward, right? I mean, the gorillas are in this habitat. You've already shown me it's a sharp border. That's that. Well, that is probably the habitat when you're thinking of trees and how they're changing over time and whatnot, and maybe even some of the other wildlife. But the way we look at it is the habitat for the gorillas, in our expansive view of it, is anywhere that there's pathogens that are going to interact, or organisms that are going to interact with the gorillas. And so it can expand or contract depending on what your thinking is. So if we just think about the gorillas, yes, they're confined within that habitat. But if we start thinking, well, there's organisms going from the community back and forth, it then expands out, and the same with the domestic animals. But when we actually think about it, when we start thinking about tourism, and these tourists are coming from all over the world, it's a giant habitat, actually, that you sort of have to think about. And obviously, I'm not going to be going out anywhere but in this park to deal with the gorillas, but you have to be thinking on more of a global concept. And then we do health monitoring, and we have the 14 veterinarians going out, and we developed this system called Impact. It's a computerized system, and it's syndromic. They go out and they say whether they have a list and identification of all the animals in the group that they're looking at, and then they say whether they saw them or not, and if they saw them, how many of these systems they saw, and whether they're normal or abnormal. And so that's also done by trackers and guides. So it's a pretty broad system, and 65% of all mountain gorillas are habituated, so they're seen on a daily basis. So we can get a lot of information out of that. And the reason we like to send veterinarians up is because we think that they have a little bit of a clearer eye when it comes to things. And you can look at this little juvenile, and to me, you know, he's got a full belly, looks healthy, he's pretty bright and alert. But if you kind of look at him, he's looking scruffy. And if you know gorillas, the maternal care is like unbelievable, and they keep them immaculate, right? So from this, you got to go say, well, maybe the baby's okay, but what's happening with the mother? So there's some nuances, but that's kind of the level that we take the daily monitoring to. And then if anybody reports a problem, we'll actually go up and do clinical work. And people always ask me whether I'm scared or not, and I lie and say no. It can be a little bit scary, and I'm carrying a dart gun there, a blowgun, and I have a partner in crime sitting back there, Michael Clark. He shared an office with me when I was doing my residency. He and I perfected blow darting textbooks to a T. So here you are, you have two people that they're more used to seeing, and then me back here. And in here is the emergency equipment, which includes a change of underwear for me. But anyway, so two things can happen. Gorillas are incredibly gentle animals, except for two situations when they're fighting over females and with family squabbles. But other than that, they're really, really docile. So if we go in, we try to isolate the individual animal and dart it. And so sometimes they don't do anything. They just sort of wonder what that was. And if that happens, they usually go to sleep, and these trackers will then sort of form a ring around us, and we have about 45 minutes of anesthesia on the first dart, we can continue on. If the animal screams, then the silverbacks usually start charging, and their charges are usually bluff charges. We have had people injured, but normally they're just trying to settle things down and make sure that everybody's okay. And we use, we've tried several different drugs, ketamine, which you've probably heard about. And ketamine is a little bit of a rocky, by itself is a little bit of a rocky anesthetic. It doesn't last very long. Then we went to a veterinary product called telazol, which is teledamine and zolazepam, which again is sort of it's a nice combination of diazepam and ketamine. But they were sleeping too long, and we have to do all our work out here, and we want them to be back with their family in the evening. And it wasn't so bad if it was an adult, but if it was a juvenile and the group had moved on, then he'd be all by himself and really stressed out. So we now go with ketamine and medetomidine, and medetomidine is reversible, so we can reverse it anytime we want. And often we deal with the juveniles and the babies, and so we have to knock down the mothers, or anesthetize. Knock down is a veterinary term. That's pretty rude. We anesthetize the parents to get to the babies, and that's always a trick, to get a dart into both of them and then get them to be recovered together. This is a 2-day-old infant that had a severely macerated ankle and lower leg that we actually amputated, and the animal's doing really well. A lot of our work is for snares, and snares are for bushmeat, but the bushmeat is they're not the people, the criminals, poachers, are not targeting gorillas. In East Africa, they don't eat primates. In West Africa, they eat primates. However, so they're going after bush bucks and dikers and things like that, but the gorillas will often get caught in them. So a lot of our work has to do with snares. But this is an interesting case. This is Kashangi, a mountain gorilla in DRC, and she showed up with this lesion. And she had a young baby on her, and we were sort of monitoring the lesion, and then she disappeared. And we thought that she died, gone off and died. And lo and behold, she comes back about 3 months later, but without her child, and she's really, really, really sick and ill. So we did field surgery to remove that, and then we have technology now. This is a cool scope, it's called. And you can put a histological slide in there, and Linda Lowenstein, sitting at UC Davis, can drive this microscope and see it on her screen, which is really, really cool. Which brings up a bunch of different things. That now, for teaching and technology and capacity building, there's telemedicine. So you might not have the time or the energy or the finances to go somewhere to help when you're a doctor, but by telemedicine you can still be practicing medicine with these people in their communities. So came back to be a melanoma, which you all know is a very nasty tumor. This is the jaw resected. Went through a course of antibiotics. I'm sure the animal had some secondary problems going on, and she recovered very, very well, actually. And it was probably about 6 to 8 months, and then all of a sudden she came back and it had reoccurred. And so we tried using a tyrosine DNA vaccine, which is used in people against melanomas, and some respond well and some don't, and this unfortunately didn't. So we do all kinds of different clinical work in the field. Obviously it's limited in its scope because we don't take them out, and it's really tough for aftercare. And we might want to use a specific antibiotic, but we can't get the right volume, get it in darts, and we can't deliver it 2 or 3 times a day. So we are somewhat limited. So when the animals die, they're brought out of the forest, and we do postmortems on them. And we do very extensive gross postmortems, and then collect all the tissues for histology. And this is basically what we found. The trauma was responsible between 40 and 50% of deaths of gorillas. And there's different kinds of trauma. There's human trauma from the snares and from gun wounds and spears, believe it or not. That probably accounts for maybe 10%. And then there's gorilla-gorilla interactions, like the silverbacks have horrendous fights with each other to take over females. And sometimes the females get hurt in those, so that adds another factor. But then there's the infanticide, and I think you probably all heard of infanticide. It's really widespread in the animal kingdom. Lions do it, a lot of different animals do it. But when a silverback takes over a group, if there's infants in that group, he kills all the infants under 3 years of age. And that is a good sort of evolutionary scheme as far as genetics go, and it actually doesn't hurt the population that much, because it's not like you've got to wait another whole generation gap to get another baby. One of the reasons he does that is because the female won't cycle while she's nursing, and it's 4 years, and he wants to get his genes in the gene pool, so if he kills the baby, they start cycling right away, so you don't lose even 4 years. And there's not a whole bunch that we can do about that except remove the snares and whatnot and treat when we can. But the second largest category is respiratory diseases, and we're going to be talking about that. And so we spend a lot of time and effort on respiratory diseases. And then after that, there's dribs and drabs. But this helps us focus our time and energy, and I will speak a little bit more about that. So when we're working on an animal, we may not get our hands on that animal again, ever. Maybe it will die and we won't even find the body. So when that animal is anesthetized, we collect samples to do diagnostics for that clinical case, serology so we can find out what's going on in that group or community, and then we save thousands upon thousands of samples into a biobank. And from that biobank, we've done complete genomes on all the subspecies of gorillas at this point, complete genomes. And that's fascinating to me, because then they can look at the whole human genome, and people are looking at what deleterious genes are in people that are in gorillas, and are they having the same outcomes and whatnot. So it's really important stuff. In fact, they got 2 requests for lice, gorilla lice. And we thought, well, that's a little strange, you know? But evidently, louse evolution and their host evolution are really closely linked. And so we sent the lice out, and then about 3 or 4 months later, the first group came out with an article that they thought the gorilla louse came from human Pteris pubis, or the crab louse. So it was kind of an odd ending to that. But so we spend a lot of time with PREDICT and whatnot building cold chains, and they're very important. And the cold chains are important both for humans and animals and domestic animals. And so this is where we can sort of share some of our efforts. Other wildlife, we worry mainly about primates in the area, because primates in the same habitat share more common they have more diseases in common than the same species across different habitats. So we can tell an awful lot about the golden monkey, or an awful lot about the gorilla from the golden monkey, and vice versa. And then if you find differences, like in serology, their exposure to diseases, then you can go back and start thinking, why has this one got a high prevalence of this disease and not that one? And so you can come up with a lot of interesting things about disease transmission. But as we've already spoken, humans are probably the largest threat, and I break the human population into 4 when we're dealing with it. You have the military, and we try to do hygiene education and conservation education in there. We have the we have the tourists. As I said, the tourists come from all over the world. Within 48 hours, they're going up the side of the mountain. And they're nervous. They've flown on airplanes. They've had a lot of community exposure to disease. And there is a rule that they're not supposed to go up if they're feeling sick, but if you paid thousands of dollars to get there and $750 to go up, they usually mask their symptoms fairly easily. So we're forever looking at critical control points to stop transmission from the tourists. And then we have the local population. I want to spend a little bit of time on that because that's a big area that we could be collaborative on. There are 13 clinics around the park in Rwanda. They serve 30,000 people each clinic. And there are no doctors at those hospitals. There's only nurses. Again, Michael Clark's been very instrumental in teaching, building capacity in the nursing because it's such a big part of their medical system. And it's rudimentary. I mean, if you've got the 4 major diseases that are there, yes, they'll deal with it. But if you're unusual, it's rather difficult. And that's where we need to build capacity, right in this community that's right around the park. So then if you get the triage there and moved on, you go to the Ruangari Hospital. And the Ruangari Hospital has a catchment of 500,000 with 20 doctors. 1 doctor on night. So you can, and with that hospital, we are sending last year residents from UC Davis there to help build capacity. But there's a lot of room for improvements here. And then you have the trackers and guides. So the trackers and guides, when you think about it, they're a finite, trackers, guides, and porters. They're a finite population. There's only so many of them. They don't change very often. They are with the tourists probably longer than anybody is with the gorillas. So, and then every day they're close to the gorillas. So they are an important population and could actually be sort of the inadvertent vector to get the disease into the gorillas. Here's the tourists. They're supposed to stay 7 meters away at all times. Rarely is enforced, and the gorillas don't understand the rules. And so what we're pushing for right now, and we have it in one country and we're trying for the other 2, is that they wear surgical masks when they're in close contact. So the employee health program was started in 2000, and we do a large, well, first of all, we sensitize them to the program and educate them what it's all about. And then they get a questionnaire that sort of tells us about their lifestyle, and then they get screened, their fecals, their urine, and their blood, and they get an exam, and they're vaccinated for appropriate diseases. And we found a few things of note. One is that up to 60% of them needed eyeglasses. They'd never been to a doctor before. They had no concept that they needed eyeglasses. So that was just kind of a nice one-off kind of deal. There was about 10% HIV rate prevalence in the population when we started. It's down to about 4 now. And when we started, there actually was no treatment in Africa. They got doxycycline and counseling. And so we sort of pushed the envelope, and we're on the verge of bringing in antiretroviral drugs just for that population. And there was a lot of legality and ethical issues around that, and thank God the World Health Organization sort of stepped in. So the other biggest problem, and probably the most zoonotic problem, is internal parasites, gastrointestinal parasites. And they're about 53% positive. And we used to deworm them once a year at this program. And we found that they just got reinfected. So it was a very ineffective approach. So now we deworm them and their families 4 times a year. And every time we have the families in there, we give an educational program too. And in the last one, we're finding that in Congo, the nutrition program, their physical condition was not very good because of nutritional issues and how hard the work is. Also that there was a high level of alcoholism and tobacco use. And so those, you sort of get that from the questionnaire, and now we're trying to get educational programs started to help with that.
Mike, can I just say something quick? So for this group here, since you're all in the Masters of Public Health program, this kind of, which essentially an occupational health program, seems just obvious. But I think it's important to emphasize that when Mike got this program started, with the purpose of ensuring the health of the gorillas, it was really the first time that this had been done in the wildlife conservation world, and it really set a precedence, because now other grade 8 health programs around the world recognize that because of the similarity between people and great apes, anywhere where people are studying or working closely with great apes in order to protect them, whether they're park workers or whatever, they are at risk for transmitting a pathogen to those gorillas or those great apes. And so these kinds of preventive health programs are really an essential conservation tool. But I just want to emphasize that, because I think for this group, this might seem like, well, sure, you should always be providing a preventive health care program for your employees, but it was not done before Mike started this with the gorilla program. And it's really what, I was an intern of Mike's when I was in veterinary school, and when I was, of course, always eager to hear about his role with the gorilla program as that developed. And it was this program that was like a light bulb that went off for me early in my career, when I realized, that wildlife conservation is not just about hanging out of a helicopter and darting at, bighorn sheep or a bear or something. It's so much more complex than that, and it could be so much more productive and valuable for a larger community when this kind of approach is taken. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you.
Because you wouldn't.
It's easy to be the first one when you're as old as I am. All right, so that's these are actual trackers, guides, and porters, but there's probably an average of 6 family members that go along with that are in the quarterly part. And then you have the companion animals. The rabies is still a huge issue. It's a public health issue in Africa. And basically the jackals are the reservoir in the parks, and then there's feral dogs that go between the parks and people's pets. And so there's a program to eliminate the feral dogs, and we started a program to vaccinate the pets against rabies. And then it seems like a far-fetched, but it's really important that the health of their livestock improves, because if that improves, then the production improves, and if the production improves, then you have a healthier family. They're better off financially. And socioeconomic considerations are very large when you're looking at health issues. So we are hooking up with the dynamic dairy management of UC Davis, and right now we're improving things like teat dips and just basic hygiene of milking cows, but it's already showing an improvement. And we're interested in, up the top, in biogas units where methane is produced by cow manure to actually cook the food in people's houses, so they don't have to use charcoal, which they're devastating the environment for. So it's all of this huge link that's going on. Then, unfortunately, because there are poachers and because there's a perceived market for mountain gorillas, even though there's none in captivity, the people, I think, in the area go, well, if they want $750 to see them, what would they pay to own one? And so they are poached still, and then usually they can't find a market, so they're confiscated by the authorities, and they come to us, and there was no system set up, so we sort of took them over. And they did okay under our care in the beginning. And then we realized that the maternal bond was so important to these infants until they're 3 years of age. We started hiring, this is Andre Bowman, an amazing man. We started hiring caregivers that would stay with them 24/7. They slept in the beds with these gorillas, or the gorillas did with the people. They fed them, they played with them, and all of a sudden this animal that was just sort of getting by, all of a sudden was perked up, playful, smiling. They actually laughed, and it was amazing to see the difference. And we tried, people have tried to release them in the past when they were very young, and they didn't survive. So we started a program where we're holding on to them until they're 8 and 9 years old, and then thinking about putting them out there. So we have a whole system now of emergency care centers where we quarantine them, we handle the quarantine and the movement, and then they go to 2 sanctuaries that we've helped develop in DRC. You can see this is just getting a weight on this guy, he's anesthetized. So we do yearly exams. Can't go back, but I will talk just briefly about reintroduction. So there's animal welfare and there's conservation. And if a population is doing really well, do you want to take the risk of sending animals back that have been exposed to a lot of diseases that the wild population hasn't been? So it's a really tricky question. You'll see all kinds of articles in the newspaper about how wonderful it is that these people are re-releasing this. In fact, there's even people that have tried to bring elephants back from North America into Africa. And as far as conservation goes, that's not a good thing, and it takes up a lot of valuable resources that you don't want to. So looking from a research point of view, we found that Cryptosporidia, Microsporidia, and Giardia in people, the cattle, and the gorillas were so genetically related that it had to be a point source, so that we know that there are areas where those 3 populations come together. Are those pathogens not that important? Not really, but the whole plot of that they are actually that closely linked as far as transmission goes led us to this. In 2009, we've seen a lot of respiratory outbreaks, and we do go up and treat them with antibiotics because it's usually viral, and a secondary bacteria comes along, and they're usually fairly effective at treating that. But we do have deaths, and in 2009 there was 2 animals that died, and we took samples and sequenced them, and it was a human metapneumovirus. And it was a human metapneumovirus from South Africa. I mean, you can by sequencing, you can tell geographical areas. And the researcher said that human metapneumovirus mutates at a significant rate, and this had not mutated from the human standpoint, or from the human version strain. And so that had to have been introduced to the gorillas just recently. Now, whether that came from the community or that came from tourists, I'm not sure. Kirsten's going to take you on from there.
So this was really a tragic example of pathogen spillover from people, from a human, whether that was a tourist or somebody from the community working in the park, to a gorilla. But from a human health standpoint, we also worry about the opposite event. And we talked about the fact that 75% of emerging infectious diseases of people have come from wildlife populations. And so what we've really been talking about is that the viruses that are endemic to wildlife occasionally gain either the ability to spill over to domestic animal or human hosts, or something changes about the environment that puts humans and wildlife, or wildlife and domestic animals, into closer contact, enabling that spillover of pathogens to occur. And in terms of time, we can see for the most of the time, these viruses are just circulating in their host populations, but if they do have that opportunity to spill over, they can cause an outbreak, and in some cases, a global pandemic. So believe it or not, our country's U.S. Development Agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, had invested a lot of resources and time and effort in improving capacity around the world for avian influenza surveillance. And then after working on that, focusing on that, and they're still focused on that, but after a big emphasis on avian influenza surveillance and prevention, they realized that, you know, we shouldn't just be focusing on avian influenza, because there are in fact a lot of other pathogens we need to be concerned about from a global pandemic standpoint. And so they developed a program called the Emerging Pandemic Threats Program, of which there were several projects, one of them being the PREDICT project. And the UC Davis Wildlife Health Center and a consortium of partners were awarded a grant, 5-year grant in 2009 to essentially identify known and new viruses in wildlife that have the potential to infect humans. And so we've been implementing that program around the world in 20 countries. Our partners are listed below: EcoHealth Alliance, Metabiota, Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Smithsonian Institution. We are implementing the program in these countries with our partners because we all had programs already on the ground in these areas, and all of our programs, whether they were wildlife focused or human health focused, were strongly linked to questions about environmental change, human-wildlife, human-animal interaction. And so we started that program in 2009. Our focus has been to conduct surveillance in high-risk taxa, and they were essentially defined for us by USAID, but all you have to do is go into the literature on zoonotic disease, especially wildlife origin, and the majority of the pathogens of most concern most recently have come from either bats, primates, or rodents. So our surveillance has been in these species, and we've really focused our surveillance in areas where these wildlife are coming into close contact with people. So urban areas, a lot of sampling of hunters, and then really targeting our diagnostic testing to viral families that we know are the source of diseases in human populations. So for example, in the primates, we're screening samples for a number of viral families at the same time. And then where we get positive samples that are positive for one of these viral families, then we do the sequencing in order to identify whether that virus is closely related or not to a known human virus, or whether it's something new. And not surprisingly, we've detected a lot of novel pathogens. I'll get to that in a minute. We've also done a lot of work to build capacity in these countries for diagnostics, zoonotic pathogen diagnostics. So this is at Sokoine University in Tanzania. This was at their veterinary school. These two sea containers got turned into a molecular diagnostic laboratory for animals at Sokoine University, and this was done for about $40,000 or $40,000, I think, to create this building, which is a BSL2 plus facility. So we're just in our closing weeks of the PREDICT project, and in the 5 years since we started, we've trained thousands and thousands of government personnel, veterinarians, physicians, medical students, veterinary students, technicians in all of these countries, and we've built capacity to test wildlife samples for viral pathogens in many labs. We've humanely, and I always make that point, humanely collected samples from 60,000 live animals. There's a long history, and Mike alluded to it when he talked about the explorer who shot the first mountain gorilla he saw in order to figure out what it was. There's a long history of going into areas of human health researchers going into areas and just killing all the bats in a cave in order to get all the samples that they want. Well, you all have heard of things like white nose syndrome in bats. You know that a lot of these wildlife populations are under threat, and so for us that was not going to be an acceptable way for us to do our work. We wanted to maintain a conservation ethic really in doing this, and so these have all been live animal captures for the most part. Some of the samples have come from bushmeat markets, but anyway, sampled a tremendous number of animals and have discovered over 600 novel viruses in these animals, and are at the moment digesting and analyzing a tremendous amount of data to better understand which of these viruses are closely related to known human viruses, and what interfaces did we detect them in? Did we find them in bats in people's homes? Did we find them in bushmeat samples from markets? Did we find them in places where tourists are coming into close contact with great apes? And in fact, that has really helped us with the gorilla program, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the whole point of all of this PREDICT project is to move to the left on this curve. And in many of the places where we work, the time lags between these different points are so long that by the time the first case is detected, it's reported, the laboratory confirms what's caused it, and then the government can mount a response to that novel pathogen. You're way out here on this curve, and aren't we seeing a perfect example of that right now with a pathogen we know a lot about, actually, Ebola virus. So the problem is that Ebola virus arises in places where there's very little infrastructure, and by the time the first cases are reported, by the time somebody can get into that area and get a sample, get it to a lab. But in this case, because there's a lot of the capacity building that's gone on, especially with the Ebola virus, that actually, this part of it, laboratory detection, reporting, and laboratory confirmation was a lot shorter. It's just that by the time that they were being reported, a lot of cases had occurred in very rural areas, and so we're now dealing with the largest Ebola outbreak ever. But working on reducing that time between detection, reporting, confirmation, and response, and a really nice example of that in Bolivia, where our Bolivian team heard reports of several dead howler monkeys in a park in Bolivia. They were able to mobilize to the site, get samples from the monkeys, bring those samples back to the lab, do the viral family testing, and determine that those howler monkeys had died of yellow fever. And that all happened in the space of 8 days, which for the rainforest of Bolivia, getting that kind of data so quickly was really unprecedented. And really the great thing about it is that they were able to get that information to the government in time for the government to go back into that area and vaccinate all the people living in that area for yellow fever. And there weren't any human cases of yellow fever. What this PREDICT project has given us the opportunity to do some really interesting viral disease surveillance in gorillas. We've had the chance to screen over 50 gorillas with our viral family testing. We've detected several herpes viruses, some of them known, some of them unknown. We've detected some chimpanzee viruses in gorillas. So you can see how when we talk about the fact that these great apes and people are closely related genetically, therefore they must be susceptible to each other's pathogens. We're getting more and more evidence for that. In this case, we've also detected some novel viruses. So in this, we detected a new enterovirus that was most closely related to human enterovirus 90. Interestingly, it was in a gorilla that had died of vegetative endocarditis. That family of enteroviruses is the one that causes polio, and is Coxsackie virus is related to human enterovirus 90. So we don't know yet what to make of that. The next step obviously would be to go back to that gorilla's tissues and see if we can find any evidence of an active enterovirus infection in that animal. We've also detected many new human adenoviruses, including one that was very closely related to human adenovirus 7, which causes respiratory disease in people. So remember, Mike said respiratory disease is one of our big concerns with gorillas. We also detected a lot of new polyomaviruses, and in fact, this polyomavirus was found in the gorilla that also had that enterovirus and had the valve lesion, the endocarditis. So we've been able to learn because of the oppressive. This is all to make the point that because we had the opportunity to implement a program, which the main purpose of which was to survey wildlife populations for pathogens of potential threat to people, we're also learning about how pathogens of people may be influencing the health and actually impact the health of this endangered species as well. And we're just going to print on a case report of a human herpes simplex virus 1 infection in an orphan gorilla. This is one of those orphans that Mike talked about that had a very, very high level of contact 24/7 with human caretakers. We don't know the herpes simplex virus status of the actual caretakers, but we can assume it's positive. There's a very high level of high prevalence of simplex virus 1 in the area, over 90%. So this animal broke with just classic stomatitis, and when we did the PCR on samples collected from those lesions, it was determined to be human and not a gorilla-adopted herpes simplex virus. It was a human herpes simplex virus. So I think hopefully we've made the point, and this is what we'd love to keep talking about as we wrap up this presentation, but these One Health programs are not solely the provenance of health professions. They really require the involvement of experts from other disciplines. With this PREDICT project, we hope to be able to continue it for the next 5-year phase. We're waiting to hear if our application is going to be awarded, but the emphasis in this next 5 years will be on, okay, now we know a lot about these new pathogens and what interfaces might be of particular relevance or concern. Now what? What has to be done next? Well, we really have to better understand how humans are using and interacting with those animals, and because that will suggest the prevention measures, the behavior change recommendations that we can hopefully generate. So we're veterinarians, we're working with ecologists, we're working with human health physicians, but we're also going to need to involve the social scientists as well, because it's, again, this One Health approach is something that does require multiple disciplines and to be successful.
Okay, just in conclusion, actually, Kirsten, maybe you can put up the next slide.
Sure.
Over the last 20 years, the gorilla population has gone from about 440 to 880. It's growing it's really robust. It's replicating at 4% a year, which is basically the same rate as human populations worldwide. We have to worry still because it's such a small population. But when the researcher looked at the modeling of this population, looked at the reasons why the animals were surviving, even though she was a behavioralist and didn't like veterinarians, she had to conclude that the veterinary care was responsible for at least 2% of the increase a year. And so it's really, really nice to hear your program's doing well. But to me, as they named it up there, extreme conservation, we can't do that for all the species in the world. There's ethical and financial opposition to having veterinarians follow wildlife around in the forest too. So to me, people say, well, what would be the success of this project? And I think the success would be when we build enough in-country capacity that it's totally run within the country themselves, and that the One Health medicine approach is established enough that the health of the population, both the tourist population and mechanisms to stop transmission there are in a better position, and that the health of the community surrounding the park is to a higher level, and so that we as veterinarians can ease back and not worry about the population as much. So I think that for this program to be totally successful, it has to have a One Health component. Thanks.
Thanks, Krista and Mike. And I think sitting from my perspective, and I'm sure many of you will share that was a wow. It really opened up at least my eyes to a lot of issues. So we have about half an hour for Q&A. So I'm sure many of you will have some burning questions. So fire away. Just one piece of advice, speak up because you're going to be videotaped, so hopefully your voice will be recorded for posterity. So without further ado, let's open up the floor for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Louder, louder, louder.
Thank you very much.
That's better.
Very interesting research. I was just wondering, Africa has about 47 to 53 countries in it. So how many of these countries do you actually do your work?
Well, we're focusing our work in the range countries of the mountain gorilla, or the eastern gorilla, so Rwanda, Uganda, and Democratic Republic of the Congo, the eastern part. With the PREDICT project, and so our program, the Gorilla Doctors program, implements the PREDICT project in Rwanda and Uganda. Our partners also implement the PREDICT project in Republic of Congo, Gabon, Cameroon, and DR Congo. So in 7 countries. Again, it's the U.S. State Department. So when we proposed to run the PREDICT project, it wasn't up to us exactly where we worked. And in fact, initially, so they said, we want you working in sub-Saharan Africa, we want you working in Southeast Asia, we want you working in Near Asia, we want you working in South America. And so with our partners, because of the connections we already have on the ground, we could propose countries where we would implement the PREDICT project. But for political reasons, we had to shut down shop in all of Latin America the 3rd year of the program. And that was purely for politics. Well, we know that influenza, swine influenza, we had an outbreak of swine influenza impacting people in Mexico just a few years ago, right? So it didn't make sense from a biological standpoint. From our viewpoint, we wanted to continue working in South America, but we had to close up shop there.
I think the other thing is, if you look at the projects, they're almost all bunched around the equator, and they're all in areas of really high biodiversity. And I think that that's the emerging pandemic viruses or threats are probably going to come from those regions more so. So I think if you wanted to develop a program, that would be your prime area to do it in, and that's, I think, why the countries were chosen. And I'd have to say there's an awful lot of work being done, I think, on wildlife in all the African countries, pretty much. So, we are working in that one area because we're species focused, but there are a lot of really good projects going on all over the place, wildlife ones.
If I could just interject, there's a set of class members that do need to leave for another session elsewhere, so if you need to go, please do. Don't feel you have to stay through. Yes, you're welcome.
Other questions? Denise?
Thank you. It was great. It was particularly good for me. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm a veterinary virologist in public health degree, and so I got really excited about this. But I want to ask you a question that is a little topical, but I realize it's the other part of the other side of Africa and it's a different group. But what's the surveillance for Ebola now in the non-human primate populations and other wildlife for that matter? Is there data out there, and what are they doing?
Yeah, there is. It's the Wildlife Conservation Society, or the old Bronx Zoo, that is doing most of the western lowland work. And they are doing sampling of carcasses that they find, but these animals aren't habituated. So it's you know, it'd be like you doing, well, white-tailed deer are probably too many even. But if you were doing some wildlife species and it was just by chance you found them dead, and then they obviously have to have heavy-duty PPE and whatnot to take the samples. And you know, it's sort of like they're afraid of, they're concentrating on Ebola, and it's such a drastic virus that it's not like they're going to do a complete post-mortem, so they can't get surveillance on all the stuff. They can just say yes or no for Ebola when they get the samples.
The PREDICT protocol tests all samples for the filovirus family, and any positives get sequenced. Again, we're in the final weeks of the PREDICT project, but still testing thousands of samples. In all those countries where we're working, they've been screening primate and bat, primarily, samples for filoviruses. But we're not the only ones. There are of course, other research institutions, other agencies. CDC has had a long presence in Uganda because Uganda's had several filovirus outbreaks, including Ebola virus. They've are heavily invested in the Uganda Viral Research Institute and did a lot of work on Marburg virus, and actually, as you probably know, finally identified a bat host, reservoir host for a filovirus, and that was the Egyptian fruit bat as a host for Marburg virus in the caves where there was actually the tourist who contracted Marburg virus from visiting one of the caves in Uganda. So, so there are different institutions doing research and surveillance for this family of viruses sort of all over. And just remind, you know, of course, filovirus was one of the target viral families we wanted to be sure to be screening PREDICT samples for. And I would tell you everything we've found out through PREDICT, except that, and this is for, you know, I can tell it's a very international crowd. You know, we're not getting our results in the U.S. and just telling it to the world. It's the data is the government's first, and so we are very, very careful to first communicate our findings with the ministries of agriculture, wildlife, and of health and agriculture. I already said that, yeah. So in all situations, the governments are provided the results first and given the opportunity to ask questions. Well, what does this mean? So you found a new human enterovirus in a primate. Did we need to be worried now that, you know, that virus is going to infect people? So we have to have that. We have to have that chance to communicate effectively to the government so that they're comfortable with the results then being made available to the public. And that's all done through the Health Map interface. So if you have a chance, you probably know Health Map, but you can see where, through our PREDICT website, you can see where we've sampled and then start to see some of the results coming out for public consumption. So sorry I wasn't more specific about that.
Other questions?
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I actually learned a lot from it. Well, you kind of answered the question I was going to ask, because I was expecting some stakeholders to be spoken about in the presentation, but you just talked about it, because if we're thinking of zoonotic infections, we're trying to protect our ecosystem, and then we know that we have the people in the community. We need to start thinking of how to work on vaccines. We don't need to wait for an outbreak. So I think a lot of stakeholders should be involved, like the United Nations, the WHO. For example, the Ebola outbreak that's going on now, I felt if a lot of work was done before, like by now we should have a vaccine to prevent or to, when people are infected, they should be able to be vaccinated. But it's now that they're working on it, and this is not the first time we're having an outbreak of Ebola. it's been happening in the past years, but we don't have to wait till we have a pandemic before we find a solution to our problems.
I can maybe talk to that a little bit. They've been
Yeah, it's a
working
very
on
good point.
Ebola vaccine for several years, and they have to have the right platform to put it in, whether it's going to be a viral thing that they put particles in or whatever. And so there's probably 7 companies that have spent millions upon millions of dollars on this, and there's one that has got it into rhesus monkeys, and they were challenged, and it was protective. And then they took it, and it was a sort of a very controversial study where they vaccinated 6 chimpanzees, because chimpanzees in research are really, really protected at this point. And they couldn't challenge the chimpanzees, but they took their blood and they challenged mice. And the blood, the serum was protective to the mice, not 100%, but pretty much. So it's not that those vaccines haven't been worked on. There's been a tremendous amount of work. What's novel about this is it looks like they're going to release vaccines before they go through the standard testing. I mean, if this outbreak wasn't happening right now, yes, they're still going to work on this Ebola vaccine, but it probably wouldn't have gone through all the rigors that it normally goes through for another 2 or 3 years. So they're bypassing that, but they have been working really hard on it.
Yeah, I know they've been working on it like for the past, well, I think it's now that they decided to really speed up the work that's been done in the past. That's just...
There's nothing like the biggest outbreak ever to draw the world's attention, and you know, Mike was telling me that in Rwanda, where there is no Ebola virus, there's never been an Ebola virus outbreak, how many people they turned away at the border? They're screening every single person walking across the border into Rwanda for a fever, and if they have a fever, they're not allowed into the country. And they're doing the same at airports. And so it is really, and I'm only saying that because it's gotten the world's attention, and you know, we all watched as the one company that has had an experimental vaccine that they were still studying said, okay, you can have everything we've got. We don't know if it's going to work, but you can have it because we understand the situation. So I couldn't agree with you more, and unfortunately, with a disease like Ebola virus where it can be years between outbreaks, and when outbreaks occur, you know, it's 500 people, and it's flames out in 3 weeks, and then people sort of forget about it. But I don't think they're going to forget this time.
Well, in actual fact, we're very interested in it too, because if it hits the gorilla population, it will cause havoc.
Yeah,
and they're just as susceptible. Everybody thinks that it's coming from gorillas, but it's the common source, and maybe it's coming from the gorilla if somebody eats the gorilla, but it's not. They're just as susceptible. So
in fact, there are some parts of some western lowland populations, local populations have been wiped out completely during Ebola virus outbreaks. And then, so as Mike says, just as susceptible. And if this thought that the transmission is coming from gorillas is really not, it's coming from somewhere else, and the gorillas are, like Mike says, just as susceptible as humans. So we worry about it with the mountain gorillas, for sure. If we were to get into that park, it would really devastate the population.
Melanie?
Can you comment on the exit plan for your project? And in relation to that, what's your ultimate goal?
Do you mean exit plan by, as in when can we step away and leave it to the governments and the park to do?
Is that what you intend to do in the end?
Interesting question. It brings up again politics, because we had envisioned for a number of years grooming a regional manager so that we would still support them financially. And anytime they needed help, but there would be a regional manager and there would be in-country veterinarians. There are very few in-country veterinarians in DRC and Rwanda, in fact non-existent with actual training. We have had a program, and we've established a master's program in Uganda, so there's about 30 good wildlife veterinarians in Uganda, and some of them have moved to the other program. So then all of a sudden it became painfully obvious that probably wasn't going to work, because even though they're bordering countries and you talk about transboundary collaborations, there's no way that one person from one country was going to lead in the other country. So now our exit strategy actually is to have a head veterinarian in each country that works, and they'll work collaboratively, but they won't be overseen by one nationality, because that would not function. And so then you have to say, well, some countries, as I just said, DRC is not at the level of having their own wildlife veterinarians. So they'll probably be the last to have the umbilical cord cut. But Rwanda's probably getting fairly close. But then it's kind of funny because, you know, you say capacity building, but capacity building has to be within the government also. And it was okay 15 years ago when the country was broken and they didn't even have a way to get people from the airport to see the gorillas, you know, and they didn't have any money. We raised all the money to do this program. Now they're making $20 million in permits, but they won't pay for their employees to go through our employee health program. And to me, that's capacity building too. They have to take on the responsibility, and they have to say, well, the way of doing business for gorillas, you need this program, and so we got to include it. We can't just say it's all profit, because it's not. So it's a very difficult, tenuous road that is very painful, but we are trying.
And just to add to that, from a biological standpoint, we don't know what is the target population size for mountain gorillas. It's not ever a decision we would make by ourselves. It would always be with all the stakeholders, with the park authority, with the wildlife managers, with the other organizations that work to conserve gorillas. So we're the veterinarians, but there are other organizations that are paying for anti-poaching patrols, other organizations researching the animals. So it's not really up to us. But I think everyone feels that the world the habitat there could support more mountain gorillas, so our work is not yet done. But I think at some point, the world will have to decide how many gorillas are we willing to lose to snares and things before we have a full-blown veterinary program. So,
and as you presented this, I was just wondering what the buy-in is like in the country in terms of ownership of what you're doing, and therefore some form of continuation when you leave.
Yeah.
Well, we've been there 26 years, and we've talked about leaving since the first year, so we've got a ways to go, but it truly is one of our goals.
I mean, we're absolutely there at the pleasure of the governments, with their permission and their blessing, and I think, and they're very keen to see us continue with the capacity building we do within the organization, so that if, for whatever reason, we were leaving, if we ran out of money and we had to leave, there are veterinarians in all those countries that can do the work. And so, at the very least, there would be individuals who have the expertise and the knowledge to be able to continue the work, whether the government would decide that it's worthy of investment of government dollars would be their decision. It always is, you know.
Other questions?
Hey, thanks for the talk. It's great.
Louder.
Sorry. Are there any specific pathogens that you're monitoring closely or that you're most concerned about in the livestock populations along the edges of the habitats right now?
Well, we worry about the GI, some of the GI protozoal parasites that are zoonotic and could be transmitted, like Giardia and Cryptosporidium. Always worried about bovine tuberculosis. Not just for the gorillas, but for the people, because there are certainly other parts of Africa, other parts of the world where bovine tuberculosis does cause a morbidity and mortality in human populations. So, but it's kind of more, Mike, you probably would speak to this better than me, but it's not just about the pathogens and their ability to infect gorillas, it's about the health of the animals themselves. So when they're not healthy, they're not producing milk for the families that own them. The families are then forced to go into the forest to extract resources when, if they had ample, supply of nutrients and calories in their backyard, they might not have to do that.
So back in the 50s, there was a lot of human TB in farm children in Canada until they sort of cleaned it up. And we know that there's bovine tuberculosis in the cows, and so it's smoldering within the population, and it's hard to get compliance with treatment. So it is a major problem, and particularly when you got a background of HIV going on. Now, it's one of those things. Would be obviously viruses could be easily transmitted. TB's not really easily transmitted, but if it ever got into the population, it would be devastating because it would just smolder. There would be no way to treat or to look after it. It would just be this background dismal disease.
Shannon, you had your hand up?
I was pointing that there was a question. But
You were pointing at somebody. All right, was there other questions here? Ian?
So I'm going to be the bad social scientist at the back of the room and
Okay.
ask probably one of the frustrating questions. And I definitely appreciate, because I think it's really, really important to consider the impact of human life on other species and the impact of other species on human life, and then we take into consideration that we only have one of these rocks to live on right now. I think that's really key. But I'm concerned, and I suppose this is a national level concern, that when we do the occupational workplace health stuff and we do these education outreach things, are you finding that there's troubles that arise between the families that get the benefits of this and the people who want these good jobs? And perhaps that's part of the reason why governments are reticent to become involved in being the people who make those choices? Or is that something that you think is maybe less of an issue and maybe more of a potential for spreading the education that these people receive?
Well, I think that first of all, there is community benefit. A certain percentage of the money made goes back, and they're schools, hospitals, and water systems and whatnot. So they're sort of well aware that they're getting a benefit from the gorillas. But that in itself can affect conservation. Just as you said, people will say, well, I'm going to move near the park. Instead of like, you know, you can enhance your problem. So it is difficult. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
Well, and so we talk about occupational health, employee health program. They're not our employees. They're actually the employees of the park. And so it's not up to us who the park employs and who they keep on their staff. It is our job to point out the fact that they represent a disease risk to the gorillas. And so Mike developed this employee health program. But what's interesting, we've run into it. So we think that it's probably, we'd like to think that it's actually would help some of these employees love their job and want to stay in it and do a good job and not be released for some reason, because one of the many things they're getting out of it besides a paycheck is better health care for their family. I've never heard of animosity expressed towards those families. I think everybody, you know, envies a good permanent job in the community, and I think there's probably a certain level of admiration for all the park workers because they have good jobs, they make good pay. They also happen to be able to be enrolled in this preventive health program. We've tried to do this program in Uganda, and the Uganda Wildlife Authority, which runs the parks, said, great idea, we would love for you to do an employee health program in Bwindi and Penetrable Park where the gorillas live, and we want you to do it in all the other parks in Uganda. Well, that was so far outside our mission. We're a gorilla conservation organization, so we can afford that, and we couldn't justify that with our mission because we are not in charge of the wildlife in Kadepo or Murchison Falls or any of these other parks. But because we said, no, we can't do that. We're a gorilla program. We want to focus on your park personnel in Bwindi who come into close contact with gorillas because gorillas are susceptible to many of the same pathogens. They said, sorry, if we can't make it available to all our employees, we're not going to make it available just a subset. So we've only been able to implement the employee health program in Uganda with our own staff and with the staff of the research station there in the forest, but not for the Uganda Wildlife Authority personnel. So
you totally answered my question. It is in various places a distinction. We were talking earlier about the difference between equity and equality in our class, and equal isn't probably something that's going to be possible.
We have a graduate student enrolled at UBC in Vancouver who, she's a veterinarian and now is getting her PhD in public health, and she is going to be taking a look at our employee health program and looking at it, doing an assessment of its efficacy, not just from a human health standpoint, but whether it's actually achieving its conservation goals as well. And I just wanted to point out, had the opportunity to meet a guy who started an NGO in Southern Africa called Wild for Life, and the whole purpose of his conservation organization, who's all about wildlife, was to ensure that park personnel in Southern Africa were getting HIV tested and had access to antiretrovirals because the parks were losing their personnel who had all the wisdom, all the knowledge, all the courage to protect the parks and their wildlife, and that the departments were getting devastated by this disease. And so his whole conservation organization, wildlife conservation organization, was just about getting park personnel tested and on to treatment as a way to make sure that they're still around to help the wildlife. So I just thought that was a neat, another example of how the human health has such a tremendous impact on wildlife conservation and vice versa.
Thank you. Other questions? Michael?
Thanks for this. It was very enlightening. Besides learning how to use a blowgun with you, Mike, we did a lot of other interesting things as well. I was really interested to see that you didn't talk about climate change at all. And I'm sure I've seen it myself, the effect of climate change in many parts of the developing world, including Rwanda. How is it impacting on your findings and the work that you do? I'm very curious to know more about that.
Well, it's certainly not an area of expertise of our group, but we will see the consequences of it. And we're looking at malaria and vectors and how that's changing in the area. And there is some vegetational changes in the park, which may change the carrying capacity of the park. But that's, again, that's outside my expertise, but I do think that it's going to have an impact.
We have not seen malaria in the mountain gorillas yet. That's partly because the vectors aren't there. So with climate change, vectors, in fact, I think they have been documenting that the altitudinal gradient for the vectors it's encroaching on the park. So I don't know. I think that would be the one that we worry about the most in the near term. It's just vector distributions, and like Mike said, habitat change that reduces the habitat even more. You know, park boundaries stay the same, but the habitat within it changes and becomes less.
They have a tremendous variation in their diet. They're total vegetarians. They eat no meat whatsoever, and they eat on about 60 different varieties of plants. But they get most of their moisture from eating. They very, very, very rarely do you ever see them drink. In fact, they do this odd thing where they just stick their fur in the water. And just this season, I mean, the times of the dry season, wet seasons are changing. I mean, people used to predict it. 16 years ago, they would tell me almost to the day when it was going to start raining. And now they can't. And it's been really dry. And you can see it in the forest. And you can see the gorillas are not as robust. I mean, the mountain gorillas have these huge tummies with big, huge, large intestines where they do most of their fermentation, like horses. And you can actually watch, you know, when that's going down and stuff. And they aren't this last trip, they weren't as robust as I usually see them. So it's possible. Now, whether that's just a one-off year or whatever, but I doubt it.
Denise, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you to bring it back home a little bit more, because I think it's at UC Davis, and I know that they had, when I was at Guelph, I know that they were talking about this and how important it was to train medical students and veterinary students together. Apart from that, what else would you want to see in, say, North America, One Health mean?
Well, I feel like we're taking infant steps, not just baby steps, but infant steps towards the training, the cooperative training, mutual training, whatever you want to term it. I think, to me, it would be a natural fit for medical schools and veterinary schools to be together, to be sharing faculty, to be sharing classrooms, and that's just not happening. And then I'm just completely intrigued by this One Health Clinic idea, because there are so many parts of the world where there's a lack of healthcare services, the delivery system is not there, and the human health suffers, but the animal health suffers too. And if there were more places where there was an acknowledgement that people want their animals to be healthy and they want the kids to be healthy, and when they're resource limited themselves, they can go to one spot and have that addressed, I think would be really, really huge. But I think, you know, there's, in the human, it was only 5 or 6 years ago when a woman from UCLA wrote a book called Ubiquity. And the idea was to explain, or is to enlighten the human health world, medical world, about diseases in animals that are also occur in people. So the whole book is about, you know, diabetes and heart disease and things that we've all been dealing with as veterinarians forever. And it's no surprise to us that animals get the same diseases and syndromes and things that humans do. So I think more of that recognition and we've also seen it, and a lot of practitioners will see it when they see someone's dog and the dog needs to be put on a weight loss program. Well, invariably, putting a dog on a weight loss program is also going to help the owners if they're also in a situation where they need to lose weight, because the process of getting the dog to lose weight is probably going to, you know, there will be ripple effects for the whole family. And so I love hearing those kinds of stories, because I think that those just promote this idea that you know, we shouldn't really be thinking of these things as separate, but there's a lot of work still to do on promoting it as a principle or a perspective. But I do think that the co-teaching, co-location of medical and veterinary schools to me is, would be a huge step in the right direction.
I also think data information, sharing data across human and animal clinics and stuff would be really, really important. I think we find out a lot of correlations that we don't look at now.
So let me just sort of close off with a couple of comments from the public health perspective. And I'm sort of going to draw you back to something that we have up on the wall. It's our job is to fulfill society's interest in creating conditions in which people can be healthy. And what you just heard here is not far out of the pale if you broaden yourself, your outlook, and say, think of it as an interaction between the environment, the animal world, and the human world. And you can come up with n number of examples where what you just heard about has occurred during our times and has had serious public health, very broadly defined consequences. Right? Even as we speak, you heard about the veterinarians being worried about transmissions, either way, vectors between humans and animals. There are issues right now where there are certain populations which are naive, i.e. unexposed to the conditions that we have built immunity to. For example, there are tribes in the Amazon, in the Andaman Islands, the Jaravas, who have not been exposed to the human world, and we are taking adequate steps to sort of protect them, to avoid decimating them by inundating them with viruses or bacteria which they have not been exposed to, number one. Number two, even here in our own country, think of what happened when the Grand Banks, the cod fisheries collapsed, right? A classical issue of an animal sphere that was protected and gave rise to serious socioeconomic consequences for the Maritimes. Think about what's happening in the other parts of the world. Think about the tiger reserves in India, where you have this constant battle for preservationists or conservationists, to use the correct term, protecting the tiger habitat, at the same time facing pressure from the people living at the bare edges of the park, who feel that their livelihood is threatened. Think about what's happening in Indonesia, where they're burning down the forest. The whole idea being that you clear that and you plant palm oil, which is used by the Western world for n number of purposes, resulting in the loss of biodiversity, not to mention the huge plumes of smoke that create all the problems. So it's that interaction between the environment, the animal kingdom, and the human world that is a classic public health concern. And we want all of you to be aware and sensitized to those issues. And that's how we place this seminar, as a way of exposing you to these complex problems, which hopefully some of you will be able to solve. I shouldn't say when you grow up, but when you go out and practice in the real world. Okay? With that, I think we've come to the conclusion of the formal part of the seminar. As a way of thanking our guests, we just want to hand out some small gifts of appreciation. So, Kathy, if you could do the honors.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And of course, one for the primary primate ophthalmologist who made this.